Markus, the floor is all yours.
Thank you very much, Christian, for the introduction. It's really an honor to present the paper in this workshop. Just to manage a little bit expectations, this is not a theoretical paper. So unlike usually in derivative theory, we don't have a lot of formulas. So it's really an empirical paper that I want to present. And it emerged out of a research stay, which I was lucky enough to have back in 2018 when I joined Google Research for 1 year, especially there I visited their natural language department, natural language processing department. So what the motivation of this paper really is the following quote by Michael Bloomberg. And Michael Bloomberg, when the TCFD was announced, he made a comment saying that without effective disclosure of climate risks, the financial impact of climate change might not be correctly priced, and this might then cause some potential disruptions in financial markets and might lead to systemic risks if these risks are not correctly priced. So in our work, we were then thinking about this climate risk disclosure. And the story then goes as follows. So when you think about climate risk, the first thing you do is you differentiate between two different kinds of climate risk. The first one is transition risk. Transition risk comes from potential changes in regulation. So governments might want to impose some CO2 taxes on companies, which then might influence their financial well-being. Obviously, imposing this kind of regulatory reforms is a highly political process and therefore highly uncertain and very hard to assess for financial market participants and put them into the pricing of financial instruments. Something that is interesting to note is when the Paris Climate Accord was taking place in 2015, the problem of climate change was the public became much more aware of the problem of climate change, but not only the public, but also the companies, fearing that governments will eventually impose some regulatory reforms, and therefore transition risk might become a real threat to the companies. And of course, the other component of climate risk is physical risk that emerges from extreme weather events, hurricanes, and so on and so forth. And it is widely believed, or there is a lot of scientific consensus on the fact that climate change will have an impact on the severity of these extreme weather events and will cause damage to the economy, which then also impacts the financial situation of the companies. So this is the climate risk perspective, and we know that climate risk, despite the fact that we have now the pandemic, or hopefully the pandemic will go away, but pandemic risk will always play a role going forward, but also climate risk will have a very long-term perspective on how we think about risk in the future. And then we were thinking, okay, so Bloomberg said that we want to focus on effective disclosure of this risk. So what is effective disclosure and how can we measure effective disclosure? And for reasons that I'm going to show you, we're going to focus on the SEC filings, the 10K filings, and we're going to analyze the climate risk disclosure in these filings. And we're going to analyze that by using a tool which is called BERT. We'll briefly tell you a little bit what BERT is actually doing. BERT is a deep neural network, and I will come back to that a little bit later during the talk. So we use this kind of instrument to analyze the 10K filings. And then we somehow need to measure, of course, the impact of disclosure, to measure the impact on financial markets. And we thought, and I'm going to motivate this choice, that using credit default swaps is actually a good choice to see the risk impact of these disclosures in the 10K filings. And just to let the rabbit out of the hat already, for those of you who will not stay until the end, we find that the disclosure of transition risk actually increases CDS spreads. This might not be that surprising. However, we see that this effect is particularly strong after the Paris Agreement 2015, and it's statistically and economically significant. And then we find the second finding is that the disclosure of physical risk in the 10K filings reduces the CDS spread. And also this effect is statistically and economically significant. And I will provide some kind of, in a qualitative way, a theoretical framework that rationalizes these findings that we get out of our regression exercise. Something to note is that when we do not use BERT, but we would use like other methods, then the impact on the CDS prices are not that obvious. So we think that BERT is actually a very nice tool that allows us to measure this disclosure in a economically and statistically significant way. Of course, there is a lot of literature emerged.
So let me interrupt you for a second. There's a question that I think I should ask you at the beginning.
Sure.
So from Patrick Augustin, how do you see physical risk? My interpretation is that it is a systematic risk to which firms may have different exposures. That interpretation may have different implications compared to one in which it is only a firm-specific risk with impacts on default probabilities rather than risk premiums.
I think the answer to this question, it's probably better if we wait a little bit until I show how BERT is functioning and how we measure these components, transition risk and physical risk. So basically, we are using this natural language processing method in order to identify text within the 10K filings that is about transition risk or physical risk. So if a company talks about the potential impact of an increase in natural catastrophes, and that this has an impact on their supply chain, then this is labeled as a physical risk. And then we use this as then we translate that into a score for our physical risk score. But I think it becomes a little bit clearer when we move along. So there is growing evidence that transition risks are priced. I don't want to spend too much time because I have a hard stop imposed by Neil after 60 minutes, but I hope I will not use all the time. So there is a lot of literature on transition risk. So Patrick Bolton and Marcin Kasperczyk have written a nice paper on the worldwide carbon premium. There they measure the exposure to transition risk using carbon emissions of the companies, like the voluntary reporting of carbon emissions. Ilan, Sautner, and co-authors, they have a paper in RFS on the impact of carbon emissions on option prices. They find that the carbon emissions have an impact, especially on the tails of the distribution. And then there are other papers that look at the cost of equity and find that using this carbon measure, the carbon emissions as a measure, that this has an impact on equity, cost of equity. The impact of physical risk is somewhat less explored, I would say. Most of the focus has really been on transition risk over the last years. There is a paper also in RFS that looks at the flood risk effects on real estate prices. There is a nice paper by Harrison on the impact of droughts on the stock price of food companies. And we have a recent paper that actually shows that measuring the physical risk exposure is a highly non-trivial exercise. So we have been doing this paper together with Swiss Re, which is a large reinsurance company. And we have analyzed 4 commercial physical risk score providers and 2 academic risk scores. And we saw that basically you have 0 correlation among these risk scores, which puts a lot of problems when you want to analyze these scores for the impact on financial markets. Then there is another paper that is related. Sautner has a nice paper where they use where they develop firm level climate risk measures from earning calls, which is another text source, but they use also like a more elaborated keyword-based approach. There's of course Bob Engel with his paper on hedging climate risk news. Then there is another paper just recently coming out that uses news articles and looks at different components of climate risk news. Of course, there is a big literature in some papers in the accounting literature that analyzes 10K filings in a more general setting, also keyword-based approach where they do not really differentiate between different risks. And our contribution is really to look at climate risk and differentiate between the impact of physical risk and transition risk. I think that our paper also gives a lot of insights in how going forward, how we should disclose climate risk. There is a big discussion where the head of BlackRock is also involved in putting forward the TCFD requirements for climate risk reporting. These are basically voluntary reports, but when you look at these voluntary reports, let's say from Morgan Stanley, for instance, around 25% of the report are nice high resolution color pictures, and they do not really give a lot of information, at least in my view. And we have a paper where we introduce so-called climate BERT, which is another algorithm that analyzes these voluntary reports. So our goal is to analyze the impact, the different impact of transition risk and physical risk. We find different results, so I therefore want to give a little bit of a justification of why different results can emerge. And for that, you have to think about how risk disclosure might impact credit spreads. First of all, there is something like a risk perception effect. If a company discloses more information about the risk exposure, you could argue that investors say, oh, wow, that's a new risk, so I have to account for that new risk exposure and therefore require a higher premium. And interesting is now to explore a little bit the effect of this risk perception effect on the term structure of CDS prices. And for that, you can use a simple model like a Merton model. And you could argue that, for instance, transition risk, if a company provides more information about its transition risk, this might have a decreasing effect on the asset value of the company. And this is common standard in industry these days. There is a startup company, Carbon Delta, which has just been bought by MSCI. They provide a climate value at risk figure, which is basically using the KMV Merton model and translates climate risk exposure into changing the value of the firm's asset. When you think about physical risks, so physical risks are based on natural catastrophes, you could argue that using the evidence from climate science that you have an increase in the severity and the frequency of climate events. So you would then argue within a jump diffusion model that the severity and the frequency go up, and then you analyze the impact on the term structure. And I mean, this is basic, these are basic models. So you have the Merton model here. You can derive the credit spread in the Merton model. Then you have the extension by Xu that introduces the jump diffusion, the jump component. And then you can argue, and then you can derive, you can derive the credit spread for the jump diffusion model. And you could argue that you have the risk perception effect that tells you that you might have an increase in the severity, which is then like an increase in the mean of the jump. You could argue that the frequency increases, which would then be an increase in the lambda parameter. And of course, these are all positive, having a positive impact on the credit spread. Using the argumentation from carbon delta, you could argue that the transition risk would lead to, or that is caused by introducing CO2 taxes, would decrease the asset value of the company, and therefore this would then lead to a increase of the credit spread. So as a showing that with an illustration, so here we have a decrease in the asset value. So here you have the baseline credit spread as a function of maturity from 1 year to 30 years. And in the classical Merton model, we know that the problem here is that on the short end of the credit spread curve, the Merton model cannot explain a positive credit spread because it degenerates too quickly to zero. When you decrease the asset value, you see that the most effect happens for this example here at the 5-year horizon, and some less dramatic effect here at longer horizon. When you add jumps, what you see is that already at the short horizon, the credit spread increases dramatically. This is well known from the credit risk literature, and the effect is somehow parallel across the whole term structure. Now, using this qualitative analysis, you could argue that if the effect of transition risk is such that you have a decrease in asset value, then you should have the most effect somewhere here at the 5-year horizon. And if physical risk disclosure has an effect, then you would have a positive effect, especially at the short-term horizon, but also at other time horizons. This is the risk perception effect. Now, I said that in the end, we find that the physical risk disclosure leads to a decrease in credit spreads. How can that happen theoretically? And this happens through the information uncertainty effect. So the information uncertainty effect here, the argument is as follows. So we do not only have risk, but we also have uncertainty. And this uncertainty can be decreased by companies disclosing more about their true underlying risk. So if there is a positive uncertainty risk premium, this can be decreased, and the overall effect can actually be a decrease in physical risk. in the risk component. And we find that for physical risk, and I will, when we talk about the empirical results, I will argue that this is actually a coherent story.
So let me jump in. There's a bunch of questions. They're all in the chat. They're all related, so I'll read them all to you, and you can decide how they want to handle them. So from Liren Wu, I wonder whether transition risk is more of a reportable risk by regulation, whereas physical risk is a voluntary report with a somewhat different, that is, positive connotation. And then a follow-up question from Patrick, which I think you've already partly addressed. Could effective disclosure also be related to accounting transparency, as in Duffy and Lando? Better disclosure is more transparency, which then affects the term structure. And from Bing Han, once investors are aware of climate risk, non-disclosure would increase credit spreads because of the uncertainty involved. And then he says, never mind my comment. Okay, so I'll stop there. So anyway, so I'll let you respond to those.
Yeah, so hi, Liren. Nice to not see you, but thank you for the question. So when I talk about the data that we use, I will answer this question, but just a short answer is that in the 10K filings, section item 1A, the company has to report on all relevant risk categories that are relevant for the company. So it has to include not only transition risk, but also physical risks. And that makes the analysis of the 10K filings such an interesting exercise and an easy exercise for this modern natural language processing methods, because it's already kind of annotated data. But I will come back to that in a second. All right, so I said that it might be a little bit surprising that we have this result that physical risks are decreasing the spreads, but you can argue that with the famous paper by Darrell and David Lando in 2001, Econometrica, where you have uncertainty about the observation of the asset value. And when you can reduce this uncertainty, which is captured by this sigma u parameter, then you find that you have a decrease in the credit spread. Of course, you want to have the same argument with physical risk in a jump diffusion setting. And then there is the paper by Liu and co-authors in Review of Financial Studies. They use kind of a general equilibrium model where the representative investor with CRA utility functions has a concern for misspecification of the jump part, and this is then they solve this model, and then you have this endogenous concern for model misspecification, which then makes an adjustment to the severity and the frequency of the jumps. And when you reduce that, you get similar effects as in the Duffy paper, but not so much. So I basically already said what I wanted to say that is on this slide here. So the Liu model is rather involved. It's a general equilibrium model, and you have this equivalent probability measures, and you have this robustness decision for model misspecification, which will then lead to different frequencies and robust frequencies and severities of the jump model. And the impact on the curve, on the credit spread curve, is as follows. So when you follow the Duffy-Lando argumentation, you have a decrease, especially up to 10 years. And when you follow the jump misspecification argument in Liu, you have a spread curve that decreases rather monotonically across all the maturities. So you have again this different impact on the term structure. And given these different impacts, I think it's interesting to analyze. That's why we want to analyze CDS spreads, because we have there a whole term structure of contracts that capture the relevant risk. So with this theoretical justification, we can actually formulate three hypotheses. The first hypothesis is that 10K filings are boilerplate. 10K filings are written by lawyers, and we know lawyers are a special kind of people, and they write the text in a way that it's legally not binding. So that would be then our null hypothesis. And then we have two other hypotheses that we argue as follows: that regulatory disclosure of transition risk increases credit spread because transition risk has not, so like 15 years ago or 10 years ago, nobody was really talking about climate transition risk. This is a rather new component and became much more publicly aware after the Paris Agreement, when everybody was talking about climate risk. So therefore, there should probably be kind of a risk perception effect. And the risk perception effect we can then argue that this risk perception effect increases the credit spread. On the other hand, we have an insurance industry which is dealing already for centuries with, not centuries, but a couple of decades with insuring catastrophe risk and so on and so forth. So physical climate risk has been around already for many, many years, and there are experts dealing with this physical climate risk. And one could argue that it's not really a new risk that people get aware of, but it's a risk that when disclosed, the investor get a sharper signal about the underlying risk. And for that reason, it decreases the uncertainty risk premium, leading to lower credit spreads. So let me talk about the data and the methodology. Data and methodology. So as I said, we use SEC's regulatory disclosure, and in particular, we use the 10K filings. The SEC regulatory disclosure is kind of interesting because in 2006, the SEC required that the 10K reports include a specific section or item 1A, in which firms are required to disclose risks in a forward-looking way. Moreover, in 2010, the SEC published a document in which they clarified the requirements for disclosing climate-related risks. So from a textual analysis perspective, item 1A is like paradise because it's annotated data. It must be about risk, and it must be in a forward-looking way. So of course, you could also argue that you could use item 7. Item 7 is about management discussion. And there sometimes the management also likes to talk about risks, but there the discussion is slightly, it's not as clear about risk as it is in item 1A, and therefore we restrict our analysis on item 1A. We also used item 7, but we found that we incorporate more noise into the analysis. And one additional advantage is that the reporting is mandatory compared to voluntary reporting. In voluntary reports, basically the companies can state many different things. Of course, they can be subject then to greenwashing, but they're much more free to use to put the company in a better light, and therefore we think that analyzing TCFD disclosures, for instance, is not as effective as analyzing regulatory reporting. And also, of course, there are some disadvantages. It's textual data, so you need to have kind of a good methodology to analyze this textual data. Keyword-based approaches would be one way to go, but we thought we're going to use the most advanced methods, at least back in 2019. And companies sometimes have an incentive for non-disclosure. So they do not want to state all their risks in the item 1A. And the other problem is that it's boilerplate language. So it's basically language from lawyers, which makes it hard for natural language processing algorithms to extract important information. Then from the financial market side, we use CDS data from Thomson Reuters. So we start at the time when the SEC was asking companies to also disclose climate-related risks. Then the time period goes until December 2018. Then we use for our regression analysis the usual suspects as control variables. For that, we use the different papers, Erickson, Han, Xu, Colin Dufresne, and others, and we end up with 447 different companies that we can analyze for our analysis. Some word on how we use industry classifications. So for our analysis, we use the industry classification based on the SASB's definition. The SASB materiality map is a way to analyze or to classify companies in different exposures to different aspects of ESG. And they have something like 7 different categories in which companies are materially exposed to climate risk. And when we do our analysis, we split the sample into materially exposed companies and non-materially exposed companies. And when I present the results, you will see what the differences really are. So let me briefly introduce BERT. BERT is an algorithm that has been developed by Google and eventually published in actually 2019. So in October 2019, it was implemented in the Google search engine. So basically, we are using every day somehow BERT many times, I would say, just to see how important this algorithm is. Since 2018, when the preprint was put on archive, it has been cited almost 20,000 times. So it's quite a success story, and it was really a revolution in natural language processing. The reason why BERT is such a revolution is that it is a contextual model compared to, for instance, keyword-based approaches. BERT can really understand a sentence in its context. So it's not a directional model, but it's a model that is based on a deep neural network. It has something like ranging from 110 to 340 million parameters. So it's really a big model. And given the time constraints, I would say that I cannot talk too much about the details. But what is interesting is that it really outperforms, and it has been shown in this 20,000 something papers that BERT is outperforming keyword-based approaches on various tasks. And when I was at Google, we also wrote a paper for a computer science conference for NeurIPS 2020, where we were looking at the performance of BERT when we analyzed climate-related text in Wikipedia in the 10K files, and when we were using BERT for collecting claims for claim verification. And what you see is that especially the precision of BERT, when you look at how the precision of BERT is, it's almost 100% compared to keyword-based approaches, which have a precision of slightly above 80%. So there is actually good reason why one should use BERT going forward when you do textual analysis in finance, not only in climate finance, but also in other aspects of finance. So I think you get really an extra advantage by using these more modern approaches. BERT is basically trained. So when you use BERT, BERT is a neural network that needs to be further pre-trained on one hand and fine-tuned on the other hand. The pre-training usually occurs in two steps. One is so-called masked language modeling, where you mask certain words, and then the neural network learns to predict the word that is masked. And by doing that, you learn BERT to understand the context of a given sentence. And the other learning task for pre-training a BERT model is next sentence prediction. So basically, you give BERT some sentences, and BERT needs to predict the next sentence. And by solving these two tasks, you get a neural network that is pre-trained to understand text. And this is a generic neural network. So in order to improve the precision of BERT, what we did is we gave BERT a couple of hundred different corporate sustainability reports, so that BERT starts to understand the peculiarity of the company's language. And we pre-trained BERT on this big corpus of corporate sustainability reports. So that was the first step. And the second step is the fine-tuning. So for fine-tuning, we need to have annotated data that tells BERT that, okay, this sentence is about transition risk, and this sentence is about physical risk, or this sentence is not about climate risk. So in order to do that, you need annotated data. So we took data from the TCFD webpage, from the best practice reports that they put there, and we fed BERT with these sentences so that we can train BERT on the sentences. And then we also had human annotators that were helping us to improve the precision of BERT. And you see that for the TP task, which is the task to differentiate between climate transition risk and physical risk, the accuracy is around 91%, compared with a bag of words approach that has below 60% accuracy. So this is quite an improvement of the accuracy. And then we use this BERT model for analyzing our 10K files. So we were using BERT to classify sentences, and similar as in the keyword-based approach literature, we then used the amount of sentences that were about physical risk or transition risk and put that into perspective to the whole length of the item 1A section, so that we use this score as a proxy for the climate risk disclosure of the company. So it's always important to keep in mind that we are measuring disclosure of the company and not necessarily directly the climate risk exposure. So there is a slight difference in these two concepts. What we then use is a first difference panel regression stated here. So basically we are following the classical literature on CDS spreads. Zhang and co-authors published in 2009 a paper, so we borrow their approach, but we use differences because it has been noted in the accounting literature that especially when you use textual analysis, you should build your regression on differences, because often companies use similar sentences across time, and you can then better capture changes in these disclosures by using differences. As I said, and it was mentioned by other literature, the Paris Agreement was a pivotal point in the public awareness of climate risk, and we use a Paris Agreement dummy also for our analysis. So the results are as follows. So first, we look at the whole sample from 2010 to 2018, end of 2018, and we look at our physical risk score and transition risk score. As I mentioned, we differentiate between the whole sample of our companies, the companies that have non-material exposure to climate risk based on the SASB classification. And then we look at the classification based on the SASB that gives the companies a material exposure to the to credit risk, to climate risk. So what we see here, when you look at transition risk, you see that there is a slightly positive impact on the credit default swap curve by disclosing transition risk. So there is some evidence for a risk perception effect because the transition risk increases the credit spread. However, the significance is still kind of moderate, but these results give us some indication that obviously the hypothesis, the null hypothesis that the regulatory disclosure is just boilerplate is not fulfilled. But we wanted to go one step further then and analyze what happens when we take into account the Paris Agreement. So for that, as I mentioned already, we introduce a dummy for accounting for the Paris Agreement. And what we see now is that the impact, especially at the longer end of the credit spread curve, is becoming highly significant and also much larger compared to the whole full sample analysis. So we see that obviously there is a big impact of transition risk disclosure after the Paris Agreement, which leads to a higher credit spread. What we don't see on the other hand is that it has an impact on that the physical risk component has an impact on the CDS curve. And for that reason, we were going back to the SASB classification, and the SASB classification has a specific component which is called physical climate risk. And the companies that are in this physical climate risk categories, they're assumed to have material exposure to physical climate risk. And for that reason, we were narrowing down again our regression analysis, and we were only taking into account those companies that belong to the physical risk exposure according to the SASB classification. And what we see there now is a very strong information uncertainty effect. That is, disclosure in this category leads to a more precise signal, and investors in the CDS market take this signal on average, which then reduces the CDS spread. So for that reason, we find some confirmation on our hypothesis that the disclosure of physical risk results in a decrease of the CDS spread due to the uncertainty reduction effect. So summarizing, you see the following patterns. So here on the right-hand side, on the left-hand side, you see the statistical significance of transition risk disclosure. So transition risk disclosure leads to a slight increase of the CDS spread, which, depending on how many colored squares you have here, is significant at the 1 or 5 or 10% level. The most significant impact is seen here at the 5-year maturity. And it's also economically significant because at the 5-year maturity, a 1 standard deviation increase in transition risk disclosure leads to an increase of approximately 7 basis points in the average 5-year CDS spreads in the post-Paris period. And this is about a 4.3% increase in the average. So this is, I would say, economically significant, and theoretically it's consistent with the risk perception effect. The second summary or conclusion that we draw from our analysis is that the physical risk disclosure has a statistically significant effect on the term structure. So it's very similar to the effect of the transition risk, except that the sign is reversed. So it leads to a decrease, and this decrease is most significant at the 5 and 10-year horizon. And it is also economically significant. So it would lead to a reduction of the CDS spread of about 4.1% on average for the 5-year contract. And this observation is in line with the uncertainty reduction effect that I outlined in the theory section. As usual in finance, you have to do tons of robustness checks. Due to the time constraint, I want to be very brief here. So what kind of robustness checks did we do? We looked at a risk score which was provided by Ceres and Cook ESG, which is basically a keyword-based approach. They were analyzing the 10K files using a lexicographic approach. And when we use this data from Ceres, we basically do not find anything meaningful here when we do the same analysis. So the keyword-based approach, which a lot of papers in computer science have shown that it's not the right way to go forward, also fails to some extent when we use that for our analysis. The second robustness check is we use the firm level risk scores from Sautner. So again, here, the difference between our data and the data by Sautner is that Sautner uses earning calls as the data source, and we use 10K filings. So of course, there must be a lot of differences when you use different text sources. We could argue that when it comes to risk management, the item 1A of the 10K filings would potentially provide a clearer measure of what is going on in the CDS market. And we see this kind of effect also when we use the paper, the risk score by Sautner, because it probably measures something else than we want to measure for exploring the effect in the CDS market. We do not get a coherent story when we use that measure for the post-Paris period and for the whole period. Another robustness check that we did is we used emissions, because it's commonly believed that the emissions, the voluntary statements of emissions of companies is a good proxy for transition risk. Again, when we do this exercise, we do not see a clear-cut effect in our regression analysis. So therefore, we conclude, as an overall conclusion, we think that by providing this novel metric of climate risk that is based on this mandatory 10K disclosures, we provide an interesting score that allows us to analyze not only CDS spreads. The story that we get by analyzing the CDS spread seems to be very coherent with our intuition, but we could also analyze different markets as well. The results are most probably due to the fact that BERT is a contextual algorithm that understands the context, so it can differentiate between the business climate and climate change. So it really understands the context of the words within a sentence or even within a paragraph. One remark here is that BERT was developed in 2018. So as a computer scientist, one would say that this is already quite old, this model. And indeed, there are more powerful models that already have been developed and are freely available that would probably improve the analysis of text. And we have recently worked on such a model. So it's based on Roberta, but we call it Climate BERT, that has now been analyzing voluntary reports. And as you can imagine, analyzing voluntary reports is much more difficult than analyzing regulatory reports, because regulatory reports have a clear structure that companies must follow. And for that reason, when you want to analyze this data with algorithms, it's much easier than analyzing the unstructured voluntary climate risk disclosures of companies. And having that said, that's the end of my presentation. So thank you very much for staying in the line, and I'm happy to take questions.
All right, thanks very much, Markus. At this point in the VDW, we invite everyone to, unmute themselves and use their microphones to ask any questions that they want. So this is the time when you're free to use your microphone and shout out your questions. While you're thinking about your questions, there were 2 questions from the chat that I put off because I thought they could wait to the end. So I'll ask them now. From Bing Han, I see the advantage of CDS because they have varying maturities. Still, it might be useful and or interesting to examine the stock market reactions to the disclosures of the 2 types of climate risk. And then from Jan Eriksson, I second Bing Han's last comment. Stocks and CDS span different states of the world, and this might be useful in distinguishing between transition and physical risks. I guess they're really comments rather than questions, but feel free to react to them.
No, I think that's a very good question, and actually, we got from a referee, we got a very negative response saying that, well, CDS is very boring, so we should use stock prices. But kind of the argument, so we developed or we analyzed now about around 3,000 different companies that have 10K filings, and we are now in a position where we can let loose this risk scores to analyze stock market reaction, which is definitely very interesting. And I'm definitely we're gonna work on that. Given that so many people have already worked on stock market reactions, we thought CDS might be a good alternative, also because we have this kind of maturity effect. And in the paper, we argue that the CDS market is populated by professional investors, well educated, which is not always the case in in the stock market. So you could argue that the CDS market gives you a very nice picture, because in the CDS market you engage mainly for risk management purposes and hopefully not for speculation and other things. Whereas in the equity market you have a lot of effects that drive prices, and we thought that the identification strategy is much more appropriate and easier to do for the CDS market. But yeah, I think it's an interesting aspect, especially with newer data. So it would be interesting to look, for instance, at the impact of Trump versus Biden, how this effect is. But there have already been papers, actually by one of my colleagues here at the University of Zurich, Alexander Wagner. They analyzed the stock market reactions of climate-friendly companies versus dirty companies after the surprising election of Trump. And they find that actually the effect is just very temporary. So people probably were aware that Trump is a temporary problem. I don't know how to call it. So they knew that at some point there will be measures taken globally to impose some CO2 taxes, and therefore they saw that the effect of the Trump election was only temporary. But that would be interesting.
So anyone have other questions, feel free to shout out your questions.
Hey, Markus. This is Rillaerts.
Hey.
How are you? So yeah, you talked that these are disclosures, not exposures, right? I wonder whether there is a way of measuring their real exposure. I mean, if the exposure difference is small, regardless of whether you report or not, I guess the variance effect, the variance reduction effect will be stronger. If the report differs greatly and it does capture their risk, right? So if I say, oh, I have a huge risk, exposed, I do have a huge risk. If I say I have a low risk, I have a low risk, then I guess the mean effect will be stronger. For the jump events, if it's rare, nobody knows, then if you're disclosing, at least the firm is knowing it in a sense. It's more of a variance reduction thing. I wonder whether there's any way you can sort of look at the exposure, expose something.
Yeah, that's a good point, and I think a point which should be, included in our research agenda when we want to progress in climate finance, because there are a couple of papers that look at the agreement of different measures or scores that should measure the exposure of a company. So it's very hard to measure the exposure of a company to something like climate risk. So we found, as I mentioned already, we have a paper called Let's Get Physical about the agreement on physical risk scores, which would then measure the exposure. These are provided by the usual suspects that commercialize this kind of scores. And while in the credit rating market, you have an agreement of something like 95%, you have practically no agreement on physical risk scores. So therefore, of course, it would be great if you can measure the correlation between exposure and disclosure, but it probably will be super noisy because
if it's small, actually, it serves your purpose. If it's large, it's a mean effect. Then it should generate a positive spread effect. If it's very small, then reporting is just a variance reduction. It doesn't have, whether you report or not, you have risk, right?
Yeah.
The fact that you report means at least you can control it.
So, I mean, I don't want to sound that I do some marketing here, but in this paper, Let's Get Physical, one of the measures we take is our disclosure measure, and we measure it against model-based approaches. Model-based approaches are approaches which are based on some climate scenarios identified by the IPCC, and they're based on climate science models. So they're trying to get the exposure of the company. So they're measuring their physical assets, they're measuring their supply chain, and then they come up with a score. And we found that the most correlation provided by text-based methods is actually when you analyze the 10K filings. So you get the most correlation to these model-based approaches by analyzing the text of the 10K filings, which could be probably an interesting way forward.
And I have an additional comment on the stock versus CDS thing. I think your derived theory, at least, is on the effect on the CDS, which is more like a tail behavior thing.
Yeah.
Right. So I guess in principle, you can try to derive the effect on the mean. The stock is like a mean valuation, which is probably much smaller. So using that either as a motivation to show, on different asset classes, these risks, the effects is very small. Because on the other side, you're reducing the mean, reducing the variance. Does it increase the stock value? Maybe, but that'll be very small. But if you can show it theoretically, right, that give you a motivation, then you are deliberately choosing financial instruments that can sort of highlight the impact of these disclosures, right?
Yeah.
Otherwise, you cannot test them. If you test its impact on weather, it doesn't have impact on weather. It's a disclosure, right? It's random. But maybe it has impact on the firm valuation. But how much, the question is, because firm valuation is mainly driven by other things, right? But the CDS is different, like options or on the tail behaviors. And these are tail risks you're talking about. So that could be your motivation or some discussion.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Other questions?